And a very warm welcome to our webinar today, Processing Levers in Sage 50 Payroll. My name is Sarah, I'm your host and presenter today, and we are joined today by my colleague Duncan, who is standing by, ready and waiting to answer your questions in the background. So here's what we'll be covering today. So we'll begin by looking at what you need to consider when processing a lever's final pay. So I'll explain how the final payment checkbox works within your enter payment screen and what impact it has on your payroll processing as well. Next, we'll explore the lever wizard, so the tool you actually use to record the leave dates and generate a P45. So I'll show you how to use it step by step. Then we'll look at different ways you can issue your P45, including how to email it, just as a bit of an alternative to printing. After that, we'll cover how to submit a full payment submission that'll include all of your lever details. And that'll be the step that officially reports your lever to HMRC. And then to wrap up, we'll go through some of the most common questions that we get around levers. So it'll include what to do if you need to make an extra payment after the P45 has been issued, and some top tips in there as well. So that's what we've got lined up for today. Let's get started. So let's start things off by talking about an employee's final payments when they leave. So there are a few things to consider when preparing to process your employee's final payment. You can find some more details on these points by following the link just at the bottom of the slide, but let's walk through the essentials just for now. So first up, have you included any outstanding payments and deductions? So remember that employee might not have worked for the full pay period, so you might need to manually adjust their basic pay or salary, but you also want to think about any additional payments that might be due. So things like overtime, bonuses, any accrued holiday that hasn't been taken. And these are sometimes paid in arrears. So it is important to double check and make sure you've got all of that information. Next thing is to consider whether the employee is currently receiving a statutory payment. Now that's going to be more in particular longer term ones, so like your statutory maternity pay or adoption leave. Now, if they do resign while receiving one of these payments, they are usually still entitled to the full amount for the full 39 weeks, for example. So you've got a couple of options when it comes to that. You can either pay the remaining amount as a lump sum when they leave, or you could continue paying them until the end of the statutory period. Now, the next thing, if you do pay monthly, you might plan to pay the lever earlier than usual. That's absolutely fine to do that. So you can actually run a separate pay run with an earlier pay date, but you just want to make sure you submit the pay date to HMRC and your FPS. So it's essentially just a mini pay run for the lever, and I will be walking you through an example on how to do that later on. Next we have, is the employee a director? So if they're on a director, are they on a pro rata basis? If they are, you'll need to recalculate the national insurance using the annual thresholds when processing the final pay. So remember, if they are on pro rata basis, that means that the national insurance will deduct like a normal employees, and they would usually have that recalculation in month 12. But if they are leaving, that recalculation essentially just takes place a little bit earlier in their final pay period. Now, if they're on a cumulative basis or annual basis, don't really need to think about that, as it will be calculated cumulatively from the beginning of the tax year. So it is just if they're on a pro rata basis. And then finally, although it's definitely not a pleasant topic, if the employee has sadly passed away, you do just want to remember their final payment won't be subject to any national insurance. So those are going to be the key considerations. Again, you can find a little bit more detailed guidance by following the link on the slide. But let's move on now on how we actually process the payment in Sage 50 Payroll. So let's take a look at a bit of a helpful tool that we have in Sage 50 Payroll, and that is the final payment checkbox. So you'll find this towards the bottom of your enter payment screen. And it's just designed to help manage certain final items when you are actually processing that lever's final pay. So what does the final payment checkbox actually do? So when you tick this box, Sage 50 Payroll is going to recalculate any national insurance for directors. So if they are on the pro rata basis, it'll ensure it's then calculated using the annual thresholds as required. So remember that kind of month 12 recalculation just takes place in their final pay period instead. It'll pay any cash rounding amount, so that'll apply if you use a cash payment method and you typically round your net pay. It'll pay any outstanding holiday funds. So if you do use the holiday fund in the system, if you have been accruing holiday funds for the employee, this will be included. It'll pay any tax refunds that might have been withheld due to a pay dispute. So for example, if the employee was on strike and had any tax withheld, and it will calculate certain outstanding entitlements as well. So that'll include like your accrued holiday entitlement. So if you have been recording holidays in Sage 50 Payroll, it will give you a bit of a heads up that they have, accrued holiday entitlement that they haven't used. It'll then look at statutory payment entitlement. So again, if they have been getting, say, maternity pay or adoption leave, it will pay the rest out. But you will see how this works a little bit better in the demonstration shortly. Now, what I will stress is the checkbox doesn't do everything. So it is important to note that the checkbox, it doesn't adjust the employee's salary. So if they are leaving partway through a period, that tick box isn't going to adjust the salary. So you would want to manually calculate the pay with whatever's in line with your company process, and you would want to manually adjust that. So, a lot of things it does do, but one thing it doesn't is change the salary. Reason why that can differ depending on your company process. So it is always best to double check. So with that said, let's now move on to a couple of demonstrations just to show you how this all works in practice. So I'm just going to bring the slides down there and jump into my Sage 50 Payroll. So let's walk through a couple of final payment scenarios. So first scenario I'm going to be looking at is if you're paying a leaver earlier than usual. So I'm going to start off with one of my monthly paid employees, employee 3, and they're going to be leaving on the 15th of November. So normally I do pay the employees on the last day of the month, but in this case, I've decided to pay them on their actual leaving date. So to do this, I'm going to run a separate pay run just for employee 3 specifically. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my processing date. So I'm going to change that to the 15th of November. And then with that single employee selected, I'm going to just go straight into my enter payments. Now you can see that the full employee salary is entered, so £3,000. And at the bottom of the screen is the final payment checkbox that I just mentioned earlier. Now I will tick this as it is the final payment, but remember it isn't going to adjust the salary. That is something I'm going to need to do manually. Now, you can see when you do select that final payment, if there is anything else going on with the record. So for example, this employee does have an outstanding attachment order, it will give you a bit of a heads up about that. So you can see that's just something for me to add to my to-do list. So I could just need to notice them, send a notice to whoever has issued the attachment to let them know that this employee is leaving my business. So I'm just going to press OK on that. It will also give you a little bit of a checklist of, what's to do next. So things like updating your records, processing the leaver details before the FPS. So I can press OK on that little checklist. Now, I am going to do a manual salary adjustment for this employee. So there's 20 working days in November, pay for the calendar month, and this person works Monday to Friday. And the employee's worked for 10 of those days. So I'm just going to adjust this salary by going into my little calculator icon. I'm just going to do 10 divided by 20. and that's going to automatically adjust my salary. So again, the final checkbox won't do that for you, but you can do a manual adjustment by using the calculator. Now, it's not necessarily always going to be that calculation. Again, it might differ dependent on what your company policy is. So it is always best to check that before you do any manual adjustments. So this employee has actually already had some overtime. So I'm going to use the basic pay. They're owed some extra hours for that. So they did 5 hours at £12.50. And again, if they were owed anything like holiday, I would want to, calculate this at this point. So you do want to consider anything that might be outstanding. So I've got my final payment in there. I've ticked my final payment tick box. It has given me a heads up that they have an attachment. So that is something I'll need to deal with at some point. So I'm just going to save that in Enter Payments. And I'm going to complete the rest of the pay run steps. So I can go into my pension assessment. I would run my pre-update reports, so get them their final pay slip, or upload online pay slips if they're using Sage HR. And since this is a mini pay run, it is just for one employee. So if you are processing just the one early, you just want to be going through all these steps with just that person highlighted. Now I'm just going to skip those steps and go into update records just for the purposes of the demo. This point, I would definitely recommend taking a backup just so you've got one handy. But I'm just going to skip that for now. So I'm going to go through and get the records for this person updated. And you can see there, my last updated date for this person only has been updated to the 15th of November. Now, at this point, I might go ahead and submit my FPS, seeing as I'm doing them early, but I'm not going to submit it just yet. We will return to that a little bit later in the webinar. Now, I'm just going to deselect that employee for now. I do have 2 more employees that are leaving, but they're actually leaving at the end of the month. So they're going to be paid on their usual pay date of the 30th of November. And that's employee 1 and employee 4. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and change my processing date. So I've got that set to the 30th now. Now, let's start with employee 1. Now, they're a director. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go into employee 1's record, do some checks. So if I go along to the employment tab and check their director status just over on the right-hand side, you can see that they're actually a director on a pro rata basis. Now, normally with this one, national insurance for directors will be recalculated in month 12. But like I mentioned earlier, since this director is leaving before the end of the tax year, we actually need to recalculate the NIC now. So bearing that in mind, I'm just going to go back to my payroll tasks. And I'm going to go into my enter payment screen. Now, employee 1, they're getting their salary, but they are leaving this pay period. That is their final pay period of the year. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and tick this final payment checkbox. As you can see, we've got that little checklist there. You can see it will also give us a notice that they are a director on a pro rata basis, and that checkbox should only be selected if this is their final payment. Now, we know that applies to us, so we can hit OK on the message. And what you'll see is it's now actually issuing them an NIC refund. And a little refund for employer as well. Now, that's just because Sage has now recalculated the NI based on the annual thresholds rather than the thresholds per pay period. And it turns out that this director is actually overpaid. So those refunds mean that is now corrected in their final pay period. Whereas If they weren't leaving, that would just be recalculated in month 12. So we've ticked the box, and that means our director has now been recalculated on an annual basis. So that's looking all good. Now my next employee, employee 4, I go just along to the summary tab. They're currently on statutory maternity pay. So we've already got everything set up for this employee. And if I go into the summary tab, as you can see, they are just being paid the statutory amount. Again, this is their final payment. So if I just go and tick that final payment checkbox at the bottom of the screen, we get our handy little checklist again. What you'll see, if I can now go back to the summary tab, Sage has now ran its checks and it's calculated a lump sum, and that lump sum is for the remaining SMP entitlement. So because the employee is leaving, they're still entitled to receive their full 39 weeks of SMP. Just a bit of an important note on that one. If you're unsure whether to pay the full lump or just up until the leaving date, it's always best to check HMRC's guidance on this. But if you go on the gov.uk website or contact HMRC directly, they will be able to give you some further advice around that. But in our example today, I am going to go ahead and proceed with the lump sum payment. So Sage has included the full remaining entitlement in the final pay. So I'm just going to save that. And what Sage will also do is it'll also produce a report that's available, which will outline the SMP calculation. So if we just go ahead and preview that. You can see it will give you the total amount that's being paid out. So it will give you a bit of an additional report as well. So I've got my final payments now entered for both of our remaining leavers, so the director and the employee on SMP. So I'm going to go ahead and complete the pay run as usual. So again, you would be doing a pension assessment if it's applicable. Any pre-update reports you would run at this point. Upload any of your final online pay slips. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip ahead to updating my records. And just something to note, if you do have people leaving at the same time, like I'd have for my employee 1 and 4, you can keep those highlighted so that you can make them a leaver together. So we've got everything updated, we've got our records updated, and that means we have our final payment locked in to the history of the employee's record. So that is a very important step, because what that's going to do, that's going to ensure that their final pay details is going to all be on their P45, which we'll take a little look at shortly. But for now, let's just run through a little bit of a recap. So we have looked at the final payment checkbox works in Sage 50 Payroll. So it can support you with processing that leaver's final pay. So today specifically, we've used it to recalculate national insurance for directors on the pro rata basis. So that's just ensuring it's correctly calculating using the annual thresholds. And we've also used it to calculate outstanding statutory payments. So in our example today, we've looked at statutory maternity pay, and we've paid out the remaining entitlement as a lump sum. We've also seen how it'll alert you to outstanding items like the attachment of earnings order that was seen, which will give you a little bit of a heads up on what you might need to do to notify the relevant court or creditor. And again, if you're using any holiday schemes in 50 Payroll, it will flag up any untaken holiday that might be due to the employee. Again, it won't actually pay it out, it'll just flag up based on the entitlement. So with those final payments now entered and updated, we're ready to move on to the next step. So actually processing the leaver details. So I do just want to reiterate and to kind of really hammer this point home, it is absolutely essential that you process the leavers in the correct order and at the right time. So here's the sequence that you'll need to follow. So before anything else, you must process the employee's final payment and then update the employee records. What that's going to do is that ensures that the payment is included in their year-to-date values, which will appear on the P45 and also be submitted to HMRC. Now, once the records are updated, at that point, that's when you're ready to run the leaver wizard. So that's where you're going to be recording the leave date, generating the P45, and optionally producing a P11 report that you might want to keep for your own records. And then last but definitely not least, but it is only after you've completed the leaver wizard, then you should submit your full payment submission. So that's going to be your step that officially reports the employee's leaving details over a HMRC. Now, when you run the leaver wizard, you'll be given the option to print the P45 or preview it if you prefer. But if you'd prefer to actually email the P45, that is now possible too. But it is done slightly differently. So your email P45 layouts are available in the reports area, so not actually within the leaver wizard itself, but you will still use the leaver wizard to record the leaving date. But if you do want to send the P45 via email, you can go to reports and choose the relevant layout. So if you use an Outlook, SMTP, or webmail. So it is important to note, just on CHR side of things, P45s can't be directly uploaded to the online portal in the same way as you can your payslips and P60s. If you do terminate an employee in CHR, they won't actually be able to access a profile depending on their settings. So if you do terminate them straight away, then they wouldn't be able to access it anyways. So it is best to either print or email the P45. So now that we've covered that, let's take a little look on how to actually run the leaver wizard for the employees that we've just processed. So let's get jumped back into payroll. What we'll do is let's walk through how to process leavers in the payroll system and get their P45s as well. So what we'll do is we'll start with employee 3. I'm just going to pop my processing date back. Who, if you remember, we processed a little bit early on. So they're going to get paid a little bit earlier in the month. Now, you can make them a leaver from a few different areas in the programme. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to get the process map up as well, so we can see all different methods. So you can see, if we look at the process map, we've got an option for process leavers just after our update records and our nominal link. So you can go into the process leavers option from here. Or you can go in through the employee and the leaver option just on the left-hand side. You can also go in specifically through the leaver record in the leaver record in the employment tab, sorry. So there are a few different ways that you can do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do it through my employee option for now. So let's go ahead and click into the leaver wizard. Now you can see the leaver wizard is opened up. We do have a few details on this first page. So you can see you can use it to print your P11s and your P45s as well. So it will give you a little bit of a list of what the leaver wizard does. So I'm just going to click next on the leaver wizard. It'll pull through the leaving date based off of a processing date. And you can see it gives me the option to print what I need to. So I'm just going to go for the P45. I could print off a P11 if I wanted to, keep it for my records at this stage, but I'm just going to go ahead and choose my P45 plain paper for e-submission. So no special stationery needed. You can print directly or preview it on screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and preview that. And you can see it will give me all 3 parts. Now, part 2 will be for the new employer to set up their record. And then part 3 is just retained by the new employer. And Really, it's just for the records. Since our real-time information, all of this will get submitted on the FPS anyways. So once you're happy with the preview, you can print it or you can export it and then save that down. So I'm just going to close that for now. Could maybe save it on my desktop to either hand to the employee or to pop on an email. So I'm happy with my reports. I'm just going to go ahead and finish the Lever Wizard. Again, you can see it will give you a reminder about that outstanding attachment order. So if you haven't dealt with that already, that would be your little prompt just to give them a call and let them know that they're leaving the business. So now I've clicked finish, you'll see now employee 3's status has changed to leaver. And the leaving date will be recorded in the record. Now, I am going to deal with my next 2 employees. So I'm going to pop my date back. That was employee 4 and 1. Now, these 2 employees have both left on the 30th of November. So if you do have employees that are leaving on the same date, you can actually run the Lever Wizard for both of them at the same time. So I've selected both in the list. I'm going to go back to my employee tasks and go back into Lever. I'm going to go through my Lever Wizard and I'm going to go down and print my P45 again. Now, I'm just going to preview it first. And you can see I'll have a few more pages on this because what it'll do is it will give me the P45 for both of my employees. So you can see I've got 6 pages of information there that I can now print out or save for my 2 levers. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and click finish. And you'll see now both of their statuses have turned to lever. So another thing I did want to touch on, if you're emailing P45s, there's a couple of things you want to check first. So just want to make sure if you go into the record and along to the analysis tab, you have the send via email settings configured. So you can see I've got a tick in that box and a date confirmed. But if you've been emailing payslips, likelihood is they're already going to be there. Now, if I wanted to email employee 1's P45, I can go to reports. I can go to employee. If I just scroll down this list to the P45 options, I'm using Outlook. So what I can do is I can hit on the email button. Just make sure you are doing it for whatever provider you're connected up to. You can see my report has successfully output to email. And if I just drag this preview across the screen, you can see I now have a draft ready and waiting for me to send to employee 1. And if they click on the PDF, once they enter their password, then they'll be able to open and view that. So that's a little bit on emailing the P45. So let's just pop back to the slides for a little bit of a recap. So just remember, you will run the Lever Wizard after updating your employee records, but before submitting your full payment submission. The wizard allows you to enter the leaving date, and if you have multiple employees leaving on the same date, you can select them together and process them in one go. Otherwise, you can just do it individually. Once completed, you can choose to print or preview the P45 directly from the wizard. And don't forget, you can always have the option to email it securely, provided you've got those electronic document settings in place. But if you want a full step-by-step guide on that, I have linked more support on the bottom of the slide. Now, before we move on to the last bit, I do want to quickly mention a third way to enter leaving details, especially if you've integrated your payroll with HR. So if you are uploading pay slips to employees via the Sage HR system, that creates a HR record for each employee. Now, if you terminate that employee in HR and enter the leaving date in there, you can import that data into payroll. which effectively brings in the leaving date automatically. Once that's done, you would still need to print or email the P45 from the report section, but just a really good way to integrate the two systems. Now, I do want to give a bit of an important note on that about the timing, because when you do import employee data, that is usually done at the start of a pay run. But remember, for leavers, you must process the final payment and update the records first before importing the leaving date. So what I would recommend to do with that one is at the start of your pay run, run the import employee data option. That will then alert you if there is anyone that's been marked as a leaver in HR. And then once you know who you're expecting to leave, just make sure you've processed their final payment before you then import those leaver details. But again, as always, I have linked more detailed information of that on the slides, as we won't have time to jump into a demo of that today. So let's move on to the final step in the leaver process, and that is actually reporting the leaver to HMRC. Now, this is done automatically when you submit your full payment submission. Now, the FPS includes both starter and leaver details, so there isn't need for any separate submission. You'll submit the FPS on or before the pay date, just as you normally would. And in the FPS preview window, you'll be able to see that leaving date in there. Might be that some of you were on our new starters webinar earlier this week, so it will show exactly the same of that, just in a different column. So just a bit of a reminder of some other things to consider. If an employee has left, you might also need to notify your pension provider as well. So method on doing that might depend on your provider's process. So it could be online, maybe via the portal, direct contact, or in some cases, no further action might be needed. But do make sure to check with your provider and make sure you've just followed their requirements for reporting leavers. But let's jump into another demo to see how the FPS looks in practice. Just going to bring payroll back up there. So I'm going to go back to my payroll tasks. I've processed 3 leavers in this pay period, so 2 on the 30th and 1 on the 15th. Now, with my employee I've processed early on the 15th, likelihood is I would have probably already have sent an FPS with the date of the 15th, but for the purposes of the demo today, I am just going to submit them all together. So I'm going to go into my full payment submission. This warning won't come up for you. Just remember that is because we're in a demo environment today. Now, what you'll see if we go through the full payment submission, as you can see, I've got some leaver dates picked up there. Now, I do have another weekly employee that's left last pay period, so it is also picking up their leave date as that hasn't been submitted yet. Now, again, if I did have any new starters, that would appear in this column here, very similar to what we looked at earlier in the week. Now, I'm happy I've got my leaving date in there. I've processed my final payment. I'm just going to go ahead and submit that for the 30th of November. That's been successfully submitted. And you can see the last FPS date has now updated for those employees. And with that, we have completed our leaver process. Now, the final thing I want to look at is some common questions. So we have pulled these from our help centre and our support team as well. Now, the first question we'll look at is how do you handle extra pay for a leaver? Now, this is a question we do get a lot, and the answer does depend on when the extra payment is being made. Now, scenario 1, It might be that the extra pay is in the same pay period. So if the employee has already been marked as a leaver, received the P45, and you've submitted the FPS, but you've realised they're due an extra payment in the same pay period, here's what you would do. So you could restore a rollback. You would reprocess the pay and include the extra amount, print out a new pay slip, and then calculate any additional payments. You would repeat the process of updating records and running the leaver wizard to re-enter the leaving date. And then you would just submit an FPS adjustment against that payment. And that will send the original leaving date along with the updated figures. Now, scenario 2, extra pay in a later pay period. This one needs to be handled a little bit differently. So you'd want to make a note and delete the employee's leaving date temporarily. Now, what you would do next is you would set the tax code to a 0T, week 1, month 1 basis, and then process the extra payment in the next available pay period. Now, if the payment is a regular, e.g. accrued holiday pay or a bonus or something like that, you do want to calculate the NIC using the weekly thresholds, even if they're paid monthly. So might be that you need to do some manual NIC for that. Once that's done, you can print the pay slip, update the records, re-enter the original leaving date, and then submit the FPS for your next pay period. What that does is that ensures the payment is correctly taxed and reported, whilst you're maintaining your accurate leaver records as well. So I do want to do a little bit of a demo of that. We'll keep it brief, but let's get jumped back into payroll. So say, for example, my weekly employee, they were due some holiday pay. What I could do is they are already being paid weekly. So I don't need to take into consideration any manual NI, as it will be looking at the weekly thresholds anyway. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a note of the leave date and remove that. That's then going to allow me to go into enter payments for my next weekly pay period. So that would be the 7th, today's date. I'm then going to go into the employee record and change my tax code over to a 0T tax code and tick the week 1, month 1 box. What that's going to allow me to do is go into enter payments, take salary out, and I can pop 1 week of holiday pay in there. It will be taxed on a 0T week 1, month 1 basis, but that is just based off HMRC's guidance. Once I've put my holiday pay in, I would do all my usual pre-update steps, so maybe get them a pay slip just to account for the extra payment. I can then update my records. To lock in that additional payment. And then I simply would go back into the record, re-enter the leaving date. And when I next do my weekly payroll, an FPS, that will be additional payment will be submitted along with the original leaving date as well. You can see it will give you a bit of a heads up to say that the end date falls before a later pay period, but as we're processing additional payment, that is correct. So I would just say yes to that message. So that's just a bit of a quick demo on how to process that additional payment if it isn't a pay period after that you are paying it. But as always, if you do need further guidance, especially if you do this for a monthly employee where you might need to do the manual NI, then I have linked further detailed guidance on the slides. So let's move on to some further common questions. So can you hide leavers from your employee list? Yes, you absolutely can. So you can exclude current year leavers and historical leavers using a criteria option at the top of your screen, just next to the reports. Now, I would recommend keeping your historical leavers excluded, as they're in a previous year, they don't, not going to matter for anything, but if you do want to include your current year leavers, do just be a bit careful of that, as when you are running historical reports, it might be that you do want those included. So just a bit of a top tip with that one. Next one is I have forgotten to mark an employee as a leaver and have already submitted my FPS. What now? So if you have already processed the final payment, this is quite easy to fix. So you would simply just run the leaver wizard, enter the leaving date, get your P45, and then just submit an FPS adjustment. And what that'll do, that'll just purely send the leaving details over to HMRC. If you forget to send the FPS adjustment, the leaving date will just then automatically be included in your next regular FPS, but as always, it is best to let them know a little bit sooner. Next question is, I have processed a leaver, but I've forgotten to update their final payment. This one's also a little bit more straightforward than you would think to correct. So you would just delete the leaving date from the employee record, discard the P45, because that won't actually include the final payment. Then process and update your final payment with the correct pay date. Then rerun that leaver wizard to generate a new P45 with the correct figures. Once that's done, you would just submit your full payment submission as usual. Next one is, I have marked someone as a leaver by mistake and submitted the FPS. Again, a lot easier than you think to correct. Just delete the leave date and continue using the record. Your next active FPS will inform HMRC that they're still employed by you. And then last one is, how do I re-employ a leaver? So you would treat them like any other new starter, but there is a little bit of a handy shortcut. So you can create a new employee record using the employee wizard or quick employee screen. But if you do have a previous leaver already selected, then it will ask you if you want to re-employ them. If you click yes, it will pre-fill their personal details, so it is quite a good time saver. So all you've got to do from there is enter their starter form detail as usual. But just something to watch out for is, if you do use online pay slips, try to use a different email address for the second record. If it's not possible, you'll just need to remove it from the original profile. So I do just want to quickly show that in practice. So if you just use employee 11, they're a leaver now and they're highlighted. By going to employee wizard, you can see I can now re-employ an employee. I just need to fill in the start details from there. So it's that option that you want to be selecting. So nice and easy if they are a returning employee. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I do want to wrap things up by just running through some further support and a little bit of time for questions at the end. So our upcoming webinars, we do have a Pensions Discovery 2025 badge. So you can earn yourself a nice digital badge there by attending 5 of these sessions from the series, plus the pensions quiz. And that is running from the 18th of November to the 17th of December. So you can see we've got 8 different sessions there. Make sure to follow the link in the handout and get signed up to those when you can. I do also want to shout out the Help Centre, so you can access that really easily by clicking on your help icon in Sage 50 Payroll. So you can get our technical support guides on there, our recorded on-demand webinars, and info on how to get in touch with our tech support team if you need to. And last but not least, I do want to shout out Sage Uni. You can do anything from bite-sized learning to full certifications on here. It is totally free to set up an account and explore. Now, I'm going to stick around for the next few minutes or so just to give Duncan a hand with any questions that might have came through. If you are leaving us at this point, you will see a short survey. If you do have a second to fill that out, that would really be appreciated. But I am just going to pop on mute for now, and I will see you all shortly to wrap up the session. Hi again, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. I will close the session down in the next minute or so. We haven't had any further questions through. As you exit, you will see a short survey. If you can take a moment to fill that out, your feedback is really valuable to us. We would love to hear what you thought, what worked well, anything that could be improved, so we can keep making these sessions even better for you. You will receive a follow-up email later today that will have a link to the webinar recording on there and information on how to register for future sessions as well. But thanks again for joining me in Duncan today. Hopefully we will see you again soon, but it is goodbye for now.